Okay, everyone, it's time for us to dive into Lecture 12. I hope you guys have been having a good week. I realize that our next exam is on Monday already. Boy, does time fly in this class. I went ahead and decided that for Friday, today we're just going to have one lecture because I found some pretty cool TED Talks and a really awesome paper that I'd like to share with you guys. And rather than overload you and blow through this topic with just a ton of information, why don't we just take a little bit of time to explore it and watch a couple of TED Talks. Hopefully you watched one first before you listen to this lecture, and just to kind of show you what it's like to look for fossils and so forth. And then at the end, we're actually going to have you watch a talk by Svante Pablo, who's the person that is actually holding the skull here. And he's going to give a talk on using DNA from fossil evidence to figure out past human patterns, which is pretty awesome and too awesome not to use. So additionally, there is another link for a paper I'd like you guys to read this week with regards to how humans are still evolving, because we are. We often tend to think of ourselves as of being exempt from the rules, but really we're not. And then exam material will stop at the end of, whatever, everything that we're covering on Friday. Okay, and then we have to get ready for the exam on Monday. I also will make sure to post the solution to the problem on the last exam. I know some of you guys, you did an awesome job on the exam, by the way. I was incredibly happy with your scores. You did really, really well, and those of you, most all of you tried that 3-gene cross, and you guys got pretty close. So I will post the solution sometime on Friday, Saturday at the absolute latest. I just haven't had time to get to it yet. But you guys rocked the exam. I was super happy. If you have any questions, let me know. So for considering what modern humans are, and we're going through the full taxonomic hierarchy, remember we're in the domain Eukarya, kingdom is animals, subphylum vertebrates, that should sound familiar, class of mammals, eutherians, and then primates, and hominids, and hominins, and Homo sapiens, okay? So you're not expected, well, it's an open note, open book exam anyway, however, you're not expected to memorize this, but at least be able to consider this and be able, make sure that it makes sense to you what what all of this means, okay? So don't just stare at it and blow through it. Make sure that you can say, oh, so we are in the kingdom animals, and so we are vertebrates, therefore we have a vertebrae. Oh, we're mammals. What are the traits that make up mammals? The traits that make up eutherians, and so forth. So I want this to make sense to you, not just something that you pass through and don't even acknowledge. So with regards to the primates and what makes us primates, okay, so remember that we fit into the group of eutherians, which means we have placenta, mammals, and eyes on the front of the face. This gives us depth perception, which was probably really important because a lot of our ancestors lived in trees. We have nails instead of claws. Okay, this gives us greater dexterity. Okay, 5 grasping fingers on all 4 limbs at one time, flattened nails instead of claws. So the whole 3D thing is actually really important. We also have increased thumb mobility. Not all primates have opposable thumbs. Consider that the next time you guys are typing on your cell phones. So lemurs and tarsiers don't, okay? And the 2 separate bones in the forearms and the lower legs gave us a greater range of mobility. And you can imagine that back in the day when we were trying to escape from predators, that was a really big deal and incredibly useful from a perspective of natural selection. Okay, so we have this phylogeny. You guys should know how to read a tree by now. You should know what sister taxa are. You should know what a node is and the synapomorphy traits and all sorts of other good stuff. This particular phylogeny is based on DNA sequence data, and they've used many different genes for this. Okay, so the bush baby group, they have huge eyes. These accommodate a nocturnal lifestyle. You can imagine being nocturnal. It gives you an advantage to escape predators and so forth. The lemurs, they're only found in Madagascar. Okay, then you get to the New World monkeys like the capuchins, the howlers, the spider monkeys, marmosets, and squirrel monkeys, all sorts of cool little critters. And then you have the Old World monkeys like the baboons, macaques, and the mangabes, and so forth. So just make sure that all of this makes sense, okay, to you, and you know what traits are what, and so forth, and how we came about. Okay, so using all of this sequence data, okay, that we have, we know that, this has many genes and it matches a recent analysis done with genomic DNA. The apes, of course, these are the primates that lack a tail, and this would include the gibbons. All right, the lesser apes, the gibbons live in Southeast Asia. The great apes, these are the guys with the robust canines and lots of shared derived traits in the form of DNA, which is sequenced from many genes. Okay. So given the knowledge that we have so far, okay, so we have a nice interesting question here that did humans evolve from chimps? And so as we know, we've mentioned much earlier, we're not touching religion with a 10-foot pole and we're just going with science and scientific data, okay? There's a very fine line as far as wording, okay? And so did humans evolve from chimps? I want you guys to think about this and think about what the answer might be. And it's kind of a trick question. And again, it's all in the details, which is what I'm wanting to convey to you as we go through class and you learn more about science. So the answer to this, remember I told you it was a trick question, is no. Okay, so they did not evolve from chimps. What happened is modern humans and modern chimps and modern bonobos share a common ancestor. So remember, I said it is all in the wording. Okay, so they share a common ancestor. That's why there's this close relationship from a genetic perspective, but it's not as if we came from them, if that makes sense, because they still exist and we exist in modern forms and so forth. So that's kind of the difference, and that's the way I want you guys to think about it as we progress through the material today. So when it comes to these three species, okay, we don't differ by much, guys. So really, there's only 1% difference, and that's mostly in non-coding DNA. All right, and so again, think about how much variation there is with regard to fruit flies and humans and so forth, and it's definitely interesting as far as, evolutionary trajectory, especially when you consider that our common ancestor was about 5 to 7 million years ago based on DNA sequence. So that's not much of a difference, and the fact it's a non-coding DNA makes it even more interesting to me. Remember, coding means it goes directly to a protein, so transcription, translation, hopefully that all sounds familiar. If not, I'm going to be sad. Okay, so non-coding means that it's initially labeled as junk DNA, but it turns out that it might be more regulatory and have an impact as far as whether genes are turned on or off or so forth, and scientists are just learning more about the role of that, as we learn more about genes. So when it comes to our evolution, we might be asking ourselves, well, what the fossil record actually tells us, okay? And so hopefully you got some information on what it's like to dig out fossils when you watch the video before lecture. And from a practical perspective, the shared derived trait that defines hominins, this is the bipedalism, okay? So most scientists distinguish among 12 to 19 different species of the early hominins, but they don't really agree on everything. I know that's going to come as a shock to you. So they're not really sure how the species are necessarily related, which ones have descendants, don't have descendants, how to identify and classify the early hominins, what factors influence the evolution. So there's still a lot of disagreement in this field, and part of the reason is because the fossil record is really incomplete for humans, okay? What they can agree about, though, is that bipedalism was sort of a huge evolutionary jump. And so what I want you guys to think about is what would be the advantage of walking on 2 legs versus 4. Okay, so this is something I want you to consider. Why would there be an advantage to this way of life? So again, the hominids are the great apes, and the hominins are a subfamily within that group, okay? And the shared derived trait that they all have is the bipedalism. So here's a question for you. You're looking at the fossil record. How do you know if a primate was fully bipedal? Because we know that they sometimes will walk upright occasionally, certain species will. And how in the world do you differentiate that in the fossil record, okay? So remember, it's not like you get these great, awesome, complete fossils. When we're digging up the history of humans, they're partial, they're incomplete, the fossil record's not complete, they're often broken, so you kind of have to do the best you can. But there are certain things that you can kind of look for when it comes to fossils, and certain traits that suggest a fully bipedal individual versus one that just kind of occasionally, walks on 2 legs. One thing I forgot to mention in that previous slide, I would like you guys to be able to read through that, okay? So good heavens, don't memorize it. How awful would that be? But just read through it, figure out what traits are located where and who's where. I want you to realize the complexity of human evolution, okay? I also want you to realize the fossil material that is being used for classification versus inferred relationships among the different forms, because there's definitely a big difference. Now, when it comes to bipedalism, okay, so if you're fully bipedal, you're going to have changes in your anatomy, all right? And so the skull is going to go directly on top of the vertebral column, okay? There's actually another TED Talk that I'm going to put as optional, and it's an interesting TED Talk, and it talks about human evolution and how we've evolved. What I was kind of disappointed in was the way it was filmed, and I love TED Talks, don't get me wrong, but the camera shook a lot and kind of gave me a headache. So you're not required to watch that one, but if you're genuinely interested in human evolution, you know, she has some pretty interesting things to say. So the change of the skull on top of the vertebral column is definitely a giveaway. The pelvis, okay, suggests an upright posture with longer legs that fit directly under the body. So having a narrower foot and a larger heel, okay, as well as having an S-shaped spine, which will put weight over the pelvis. So all of these, you know, traits suggest having a more upright gait than walking on all fours. So of all of the hominins, okay, there's 4 genera that I would like us to focus on, and we'll talk about them individually. But just going over some brief traits, the Ardipithecus lived about 5.6 to 4 million years ago. Remember, modern humans didn't come about until, 100,000 years ago, if we're lucky. So these guys lived much, long, long before us. And these guys were bipedal, though, and they were arboreal. They had small brains, okay, with reduced canines, and they tend to live in the forests. Then eventually the Australopithecus, 4 to 2 million years, fully bipedal again, small brains, slender hominins. They had a fruit and veggie diet, okay. Then the Paranthropus, 3 to 1.2 million years, again, fully bipedal, small brains, stocky hominins, robust teeth and jaws. Okay, that suggested more of a robust diet. And then the Homo, which is the 2 million years to present, these are called the humans, fully bipedal, large brain hominins, omnivorous diet, and we started using tools. Yay! Okay, so here we have a nice little diagram of those who've gone before us. Okay, so we do know when these hominin species lived and approximately where they lived based on fossil evidence, keeping in mind that, they, as best as the fossil record can show. I also would like you to keep in mind that there's older hominins that are not actually shown in this image. One that was about 7 million years ago, another 5 million. You don't have to know that one. Some experts say that the ergaster, the Homo ergaster and Homo erectus are the same species. Others say one's a descendant from the other. This gives you an idea of how much, I don't want to say confrontation, but there's a lot of questions that are still unanswered, okay? So what I would like you to do is consider this particular question, okay? So about 2.5 million years, 3 genera of hominins coexisted in Africa, all right? And so it's not a trick question, okay? So I want you to just stop and think about it and then pick your answer. And again, don't memorize this figure, just be able to interpret it. Whenever you see a graph, you look at the axes and then you read it. Go, 3 million years ago, figure out what the answer is. I'll go actually 2.5 million years ago, okay? And then figure out what the answer is and give it your best shot. So the answer to the previous question, by the way, is true. And what I'm trying to teach you is that science is in the details. It didn't ask for species, which is very often what we assume. It's genera. So then go back 2.5 million years and remember kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, read the genera, and you'll notice that there's 3 of them that existed approximately there, okay? So as far as which ones, you've got the Homo, you've got the Paranthropus, you've got the Australopithecus, give or take, okay? They were approximately there. And no, I would never ask you a question that gets that particularly detailed, tricky, let's put it that way. But again, pay attention to the details. It's all in the details, okay? So let's start talking about Ardi. This is the Ardipithecus ramidus, as Ardi is how he's known. Had a small brain, long and dangly arms, a big toe on each foot. This suggested she was agile in trees, okay? Most importantly, the structure of her knee and pelvis showed that she also walked upright on 2 legs. And, again, this makes a big difference. So what are some, advantages of walking on two legs? Well, one of them might be that potentially you could see predators much easier, okay? Another advantage would potentially be to carry things. So there's a lot of advantages why walking on two legs would definitely be an evolutionary advancement as far as that's concerned. So the next species we're going to talk about is Australopithecus afarensis. This is otherwise known as Lucy. Okay, so in all those little chips and bones and so forth actually gives us a very complete skeleton. Normally, all that's found is a partial skull. And I tell you, I could not work in this field. I would not have the patience for this. I would much rather work in a lab and be looking for genetic material. But anyway, there's a clear indication from her pelvic girdle and knees that she was bipedal. Again, thinking about what the advancements are. So she was found in a region of North Africa, okay, and in a volcanic ash deposit, which was quickly covered by a second volcanic eruption. There were footprints made of one adult and perhaps one child, and that was made in Tanzania, which is pretty cool, and about 3.6 million years ago. And the great thing about it in these trace fossils, which that term should sound familiar, I hope, is they clearly show a more human than ape foot structure. Okay, so, and close spacing indicates a short bipedal stride. So remember, when you're relying on the fossil record, you have to do the best you can to infer with the data that you can find. So Paranthropus is the next group we're going to talk about, and they tended to be small in stature and bipedal. They were herbivores. They had large teeth with flat grinding surfaces, massive chewing muscles, as I'm sure you can imagine. What I want you to consider, though, is the fact that really this is an independent lineage, and really they're not an ancestor of the Homo group. However, they do share a lot of traits, and so we have to consider that as we're going through the evolutionary history of humans. Then we get to our early Homo groups, okay? So they have, what I want you to consider is that they started using crude tools to cut meat, okay? So the early groups did have a small skull, but I also want you to consider that there was a symbolic spoken language, okay? They lived in groups and could communicate well for obvious reasons. Extensive tool use, you can imagine what that would be useful for. And remember that natural selection is going to favor an increased capacity to reason and communicate. And ultimately, this means a larger brain. Okay, so, and if you happen to be curious, Homo habilis translates to handyman. Okay. Homo erectus was the first to use fire. Okay. They found charcoal in caves, and they were also the first to leave Africa, which is, relatively cool and interesting. So that was an interesting group. So eventually things would start to get interesting, okay? And believe it or not, until very recently, about 6 species of the Homo human group may have coexisted on Earth. How cool is that? Okay, so among those here, we've got the Heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, Floriensis. I remember when they actually discovered the Floriensis, I was in grad school. They're a tiny in stature group of humans, and it was right when Lord of the Rings came out, and you guys are probably rolling your eyes because this shows how old I am. But everybody said how cool they thought it was that they finally found the hobbits, and you can roll your eyes now. Okay, so there was another group, the Denisovans, that were also probably around at that time, and potentially another group, okay, called the Naledi. Naledi. No, you don't have to know this. The Denisovans, though, will be talked about later on at the end of this lecture when you listen to Svante Pablo's talk, okay? So he's going to bring them up again, and so I'm going to just introduce them here, okay? So there was always more than one. It was only until very recently that, our group was the only one. Think of how interesting it must have been to, live back in that time with all these different ancestors walking around. How cool would that be? So we know that we all came from Africa, okay? And so as you will see at the end of this lecture when you watch the TED Talk, and as you know, based on the lecture, the TED Talk that you watched previous to this, eventually humans, Homo sapiens moved out, okay? And moved to other areas. And so the question, how do we apply this? You can kind of see arrows here which are indicating who moved where and when, to just give you an idea. All right. And if you happen to be curious, by the way, North America was actually one of the last places to be inhabited by humans, and then South America was as well. They would walk over the Bering Land Bridge. It's not actually shown here, but it's still pretty cool to know. I just find it fascinating anyway. So go ahead and address this question. Okay, and so it's not meant to be a trick question, but you guys know this. Read it carefully. Okay, so read the question carefully, and then go ahead and pause lecture and answer to the best of your ability. So if you answered the question, by the way, it was C. And it's because Homo sapiens didn't exist yet. Remember, we weren't around until about 200,000, 100,000 years ago. It took us a while to get here. Okay, so again, not a trick question, but it's asking you to apply your knowledge. Now, let's talk about what's been found with these other species. So we know the Homo neanderthals, and we also exchange genes with them, by the way, which is pretty interesting. Homo heidelbergensis evolved in Africa and then established populations in Eurasia. Okay, and then Homo sapiens, we started out in Africa, and then we just kind of went everywhere. So went to all the different continents. There are some questions, actually, as to how we managed to spread to the isolated islands and so forth that we did. And, you know, it's pretty amazing when you consider the limited technology, well, very limited technology they had back in the day, and yet somehow they managed to do it, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot of evidence, by the way, that the Neanderthal populations created art. Okay, so what I want you to realize from this, though, is they were only able to create art once they had secure food supplies. Okay, so however, they also buried their dead in an organized manner, and so they also created jewelry. And that was discovered in 2015, which is pretty interesting. So when we define like what it means to be human, okay, and the things that make us human, well, burying our dead for sure, okay, in an organized manner, having art and music and potentially, all right, and so having tools and complex tools that would help us hunt, all of these things are kind of what we would define as being human. And so, again, I'm going to sprinkle the announcements in lecture with some articles that are cool that I want you guys to read. You know, some of them are mandatory, some of them not so much. The article that I found here is about the jewelry that the Neanderthals made. And, you know, if you're interested in human evolution, this stuff's pretty cool. So this new group of humans that I mentioned, the the NALEDI group, was actually based on the discovery of 15 partial skeletons. And they were found in a burial chamber in a South African grave. And the interesting thought about them is that they had a mix of primitive and modern features. So the cave was actually found by accident, okay? Cavers really had to dig and explore the system. And so they, there were some spelunkers and cave explorers that were resting, and one of them wedged himself in a crevice, and his feet didn't touch the bottom, which is kind of interesting. And instead, it was a very narrow shaft and descended 12 meters and opened into a chamber. And once he dropped into it, he found bones and took his GoPro and took some snapshots, which is pretty cool. So I will share this link with you as well. Now, the one thing I'm going to tell you, those of you that are adventurous enough to go into a dark cave to explore, go you. I am not one of them. So, and I don't think I would have the capacity to explore the way this team has. So there's a team of scientists who had discovered these remains and helped to excavate and so forth and to pull them out. And what I want you to notice is that they're all pretty small people in stature, okay? And there's a reason for this as soon as we flip to the next slide, a very practical reason, actually. So if you look here, okay, and keep in mind the scale of 50 feet and so forth as you're going through this, okay, there is no way you could get me in this cave. No how, nowhere, not going to happen. Remember, it's going to be pitch dark, okay? So the way that this researcher discovered these scientists and why they have 6 petite women as the caver scientist, faculty Lee Berger put an ad up on Facebook, and he needed to find people for an exciting expedition. They had to have experience in paleontology or archaeology. they had to be willing to drop everything and fly to South Africa. And so in his ad, the person must be skinny and preferably small. Must not be claustrophobic, must be fit, should have some caving experience, climbing experience would be a bonus. I am none of this. I'll stick to my lab any day. Okay. So what's interesting is, though, they did find about 60 applicants. All were qualified. He chose 6. And so then they flew down there and started to squeeze through these areas and get to those skeletons. And, it was an amazing find. And again, look at the size of this and the scale. So, everybody has their things that they excel at. This would be something I would not excel at. So what they found were, a skull, and they found hand, and they found a foot, and that allowed them to make some comparisons to be able to compare and contrast. And by the way, if you are ever asked, hint, hint, on an exam, hint, hint, to compare and contrast, what I'm looking for full credit is to list how things are alike and how they're different. That's what compare and contrast mean, okay? So you don't have to memorize the specific traits or differences, but pay attention to the patterns. What's going on? How does the foot change? How does the hand change? How does the skull change? It's pretty obvious just by looking at this that, things are definitely in transition and starting to change more into who we are today. So eventually Homo sapiens would make our fashionably late appearance, as I like to think about it. And so we would appear in northeastern Africa in rocks about 195,000 years ago. We would stay in Africa for quite up to about 130,000 years. During this time, the Neanderthals would reside in Europe and the Middle East. Homo erectus would live in Asia, okay? And then eventually, about 60,000 years ago, a population of Homo sapiens would leave Africa and spread throughout the globe. So the mitochondrial DNA and data from the Y chromosome indicate that Homo sapiens evolved in Africa approximately 200,000 years ago. So given what we've talked about and given the talks that you've been watching, this should all make sense. So Svante Pääbo and his colleagues, and again, he's going to be in one of the TED Talks, they sequenced genomes from these early humans, okay? And so I can tell you, having trained in ancient DNA, I was actually trained by Hendrik Poinar, who was trained by Svante and came out of his lab at Max Planck. This is a hard field, okay? So it's costly, it costs a ton of money just to get a little bit of data, and usually it causes a lot of headaches. I used to extract DNA from plants that were found in lake sediments. I think the oldest sample I got DNA out of was like 4,000 years old or something like that. And let me tell you, I did a happy dance all the way down the hallway when I actually had that data point. And remember, we've talked previously about negative controls and positive controls. The biggest fear with ancient DNA is getting contamination in your sample. And so ultimately, most of the time, you have more negative controls than you actually run of your samples, because at any point in time, if you pick up contamination, you have to check out that entire data point and everything, and you have to assume that it was contamination. It's just so... it takes a lot of effort and frustration. It's very cool. Okay, but, and they were able to actually construct a draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome. And having been trained by them, I can tell you they're about as stringent, and they really make sure to enforce that there's no contamination, which is pretty cool. So their data comes out definitely as reliable and trustworthy, which is something that in the ancient DNA world, you're always questioned on. So the mitochondrial DNA sequence from the Neanderthals gave some interesting information, and it suggests that they were phylogenetically distinct from modern humans. However, the DNA evidence suggests that there was some interbreeding, okay, between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And 1% to 4% of the genomes of Homo sapiens from non-African populations is shared with Neanderthals. We know this based on the sequence data, and so when you watch Svante's talk, this will make more sense. And the question, of course, is what did the Neanderthals look like? And so using the Neanderthal DNA suggests they had red hair and fair complexion, and so using fossils, they were able to reconstruct a Neanderthal man. And you can see they really don't look all that, really all that different from us. Okay, so human evolution has been far from straightforward, not at all straightforward, okay? And what I want you to realize from this figure is that width is proportional to population size, okay? I also want you to realize or to be able to define introgression. So introgression, which is listed between the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, this is movement of alleles across species line when two closely related species mate and produce fertile offspring. Okay, so basically you're transmitting alleles from one species to another. Okay, and that obviously happened a couple of times throughout human history. The other thing to consider is that the Homo ergaster or heidelbergensis is the presumed ancestor of a more recent Homo species. Okay, so just keep that in the back of your mind as well. And again, you don't have to get lost in the details of this. Any question I might ask you is probably going to be, tell me about the evolution of humans, the different traits, the different tools, and so forth. And I just want you to be able to apply what we're talking about. Okay, so don't panic and start getting lost in the details, because I know there's a lot there. But be thinking as we go through this data, how did humans evolve? Who turned into who? Who went extinct? You know, all that other type of things, and what traits were shared, and who shared DNA, and all sorts of other good stuff. That's what I want you to get out of this, okay? So don't panic about the super tiny small details. So you might be asking yourself, well, who were the Denisovans? Oh, and I would say, that's an excellent question. So they were a species of Homo, okay? There was limited inbreeding with Homo sapiens. We have mitochondrial DNA sequence. This suggests that they were phylogenetically distinct from modern humans, and you should know what that means. That should make sense. What's interesting is that the modern Melanesians share 1.9 to 3.4% of DNA from this particular group, and a lot of them seems to be immune system genes, which is actually pretty cool. So remember, though, we only have a pinky bone and a few teeth from this species. Really, I could not do research in this area. But average temperatures inside the cave, around 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So for that reason, the ancient DNA tends to be well preserved. And they do have sequenced mitochondrial and nuclear genome, all right, which is also a good thing. They don't have any skulls or hips, but they're continuing to excavate in the cave. They found some tools, suggest tool use, and they also found a bracelet, which is pretty cool. So suggests that as our ancestors were spreading to new environments all over the world, this is a quote from a Live Science paper, by the way, and I will put it up in class. Hybridization would have provided an efficient way to pick copies of genes adapted to local environmental conditions, and especially immune-related genes probably helped our ancestors handle new pathogens that they were exposed to. So as we're realizing in this day and age, in particular, pathogens are a big deal, more so than I ever thought, to be honest. I should clarify, not that I didn't think pathogens were a big deal for the survival of a species, but, not having lived through a pandemic before, let's just say a lot of surprises came up in this particular experience. Anyway, when it comes to Homo sapiens and starting out in Africa and then spreading to the rest of the world, we know this. So around 60,000 years ago, small groups left Africa and started to colonize other areas, other continents, and other islands. The first group colonized the Middle East and then Asia and Australia. And this actually makes a lot of sense because the Fertile Crescent was around that particular area, and that's where we started to first domesticate crops and so forth, which once we started to shift to a more agricultural lifestyle, that made a big difference in our capacity to settle and live in certain areas. So there was another migration from the Middle East to Europe about 30,000 years ago. Pay attention to the colors in this, by the way, as well as the migration route and the timing. That makes a big difference, okay? So another migration from Russia to the Americas. The Bering Strait was at that point in time revealed. It's about 51 miles from Russia to Alaska today. And so during that time period, a lot of water was tied up into glaciers, and so the Bering Land Bridge was revealed, and so people could walk back and forth, okay, allowed migration. The most recent areas to be colonized, of course, the most recent, and again, North America and South America were as well, but Madagascar and the remote Pacific Islands, and the most recently was probably New Zealand, at least suggested by the data. Okay, so this data is particularly cool in the sense that the DNA sequence variation in modern populations is very consistent with the out of Africa origin of modern humans. So most of the genetic diversity is found in Africa, okay, and so if you look The blue, of course, is for the African genetic diversity, and then you have the Asian Europeans, which overlaps quite a bit too. So what I want us to pay attention to with this figure is that those with African descent directly, more recently I should say, populations have the highest genetic variation because that's where modern humans evolved, and so population sizes were higher. There was less of a loss of variation due to genetic drift. That should sound familiar. You guys know what genetic drift is now. So human lineages that left Africa had lower levels of genetic variation because of the fact their populations were smaller. Okay, so those of Asian descent have a subset of the African diversity. Europeans, of course, have a subset of African diversity as well, but most of that diversity is shared with those of Asian descent. It just kind of depends on the migration route, but that should make sense when you go back and look at that map. Levels of genetic variation differ among human populations. Those in Africa have the highest genetic variation, as we've said, okay, and those of Native Americans have the lowest levels of genetic variation. And these data are very consistent with the genetic drift acting on human populations on different continents that were founded by small groups of settlers, in other words, founder events. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information, a lot of data, but it's really cool when you consider how humans have evolved and where we've moved from, and the fact you can actually still figure this information out just by sampling modern humans. I mean, how awesome is that? So you might be asking yourself, how do biologists study evolution of modern humans? And I would say, that is an excellent question. So what they look at are changes in allele frequencies. Okay, so they look at DNA sequence data from particular genes. They look at genome-wide association studies using SNPs, and you guys know what SNPs are. Okay, single nucleotide polymorphisms. Isn't it great when we know what that is? And using SNPs to detect selection. What they found, in addition to genetic drift, there actually is evidence of recent change in allele frequencies that results from natural selection. We like to think of ourselves as being above selection, but the reality is that's not true. And one of the presentations I'm going to have you guys watch after the lecture is done focuses on natural selection in humans. Now, it's a TED Talk. I have to admit, the information she goes over is incredibly fascinating to me, but there weren't any slides available or none that were filmed. And so the photography, I think, was based on a volunteer basis, so we got to cut them a little bit of slack in that respect. But the information is still pretty cool. When it comes to what factors have caused evolution in modern human populations, at least in the recent past, it seems to have operated in response to changes in our diet, changes in climate, and emerging diseases. Okay, so I don't know if any of you happen to be lactose intolerant. Okay, I have several friends who are lactose intolerant, but for the most part, a lot of us can digest lactose. Well, what's interesting is that at one point in time, almost all humans were lactose intolerant, especially when we were a more nomadic lifestyle and had to move around. Once humans shifted to an agricultural lifestyle, that's when there was actually a benefit to be able to continue to digest lactose. If you were raising, goats or cows or anything that produced milk, it was a huge advantage to be able to digest that because it was a great source of protein. And so there was a pretty big selective sweep to select for people who could digest lactose. Okay, and so now, depending on where you are in the world, okay, but in the U.S., a lot of people the majority of people anyway, seem to be able to digest lactose, and the reason was because of that shift in our lifestyle. So if you can't digest lactose, and you miss out on ice cream, I'm sorry, although there's a lot of good stuff out there these days that is starting to make up for it. Back when I was a kid, there were no substitutes. If you couldn't digest lactose, you were just tough and you were on your own. However, in this day and age, they've definitely found a lot of ways to make lactose-free substitutes or lactose-friendly, something along those lines. The other thing I wanted to mention too is basically what allowed us to digest lactose is this gene that normally shuts off once we start growing up and no longer need to consume milk from the mother. That gene just stays on to continue to produce the enzymes that will allow us to digest that particular, digest lactose. And if I remember correctly, it's called lactase. There's a ton of information out there. If you guys are curious about it, definitely Google it because it's interesting and well worth reading about and knowing. And then you guys get to share that fun factor with friends on trivia nights. Okay, maybe I need to get out more. Okay, so analyzing DNA sequence data from 3,900 modern genomes in the UK tells us that human traits have been under positive selection, you guys know what that means, in the past 2,000 years for lactase persistence, remember that's the enzyme that can digest lactose, hair color, eye color, height. Okay, in addition to that, there's a gene under balancing selection, that's our MHC gene, and that impacts our immune system greatly. Okay, so I'm going to try to upload directly to lecture the TED Talks I want you guys to watch. If it doesn't work, everything will be listed in order in the announcements. Okay, so I wish you guys a wonderful weekend. I will hold office hours if you need me, probably before the exam on Monday. So I might hold some office hours. I have a feeling, if I know all of you, well, let's put it this way. If you guys are anything like me, you're going to need the weekend to study. And so I think it would be most effective if I happened to show up for office hours Monday before the exam was released, okay? And that way you guys can ask me any last minute questions. It's going to be open note, open book as before. Same type of format as before, okay? It's not technically cumulative, but please keep in mind that some concepts build upon others, and so there are going to be some things that might touch base with things we had in exam one material. I can't eliminate everything to keep it strict, but being that it's open note, open book, you guys should be fine. You'll have the same amount of questions as last time. And I think that's everything I need to tell you. And if you have any more questions, as always, just send an email and let me know, and I will be glad to let you know. And I will see you all in Zoom office hours on Monday. Have a great weekend and happy studying.